session of the annual Intergenerational Dialogue Series, organized by the Center for Poverty Analysis. I'm Thamindi Arihara, a research professional working in CEPA's social cohesion thematic. I will be making introductory remarks, after which Sarah will come over and taking on today's book reading. The Intergenerational Dialogue Series is organized by CEPA for poverty analysis with the intention of generating knowledge of past events surrounding the civil war that spanned 3 decades to promote reconciliation, non-recurrence, and social responsibility through intergenerational discussion for sustainable and intersectional peace. Today marks the 3rd session of the series. The series was launched with a discussion by Reverend Gakande Dhammananda Thero titled Loving Kindness for Inner Peace on the 6th of December 2019. The conversation was followed by a guided meditation where participants were encouraged to tap into their inner healing. The second dialogue was held on the 24th of August 2020 with the late Dr. Malati Dialwis on the challenges of memorialization, titled Memorialization and Community. The presentation explored the human desire to remember as well as forget, and to create particular histories that are often sanitized, exclusionary, and bearable. In the context of the recent untimely demise of Dr. Malati Dialwis and her being the last speaker in the Intergenerational Dialogue Series, we would like to pay homage to her legacy. Dr. Malati has been a close friend of CEPA for the past few years, working with us at different levels and sharing her unparalleled knowledge with us. Her demise is a lot, not just to CEPA, but academics and the country at large. We hope we can continue to honor her legacy through our work. While the usual audience for our Ideas events comprise of a cross-section of academics, development partners, researchers, students, and journalists, we are hoping to expand the audience to a younger generation and socialize the dialogue beyond the silos of civil society. It is with this understanding that we invited Sarah, as her work and engagement provides a fresh perspective to the civil war. Sarah Kabir is a researcher, activist, and a published author. Her work primarily focuses on social and reconciliation. Currently, she acts in her capacity as project director in a documentary project exploring the nexus between social cohesion, history, and education. Her previous work has been in both the development sector as well as the government. Voice of Peace is a culmination of her research vis-a-vis post-war reconciliation from the perspective of soldiers. This volume presents a rather unique collection of narratives from 20 former combatants on the sides of the battle in Sri Lanka, a platform for the affected but mostly unheard voices of Sri Lanka's protracted conflict, a safe space to give them ownership of the ongoing peace process. By viewing people as experts of their own lives, VOP offers an opportunity to listen to their histories, their present, and their hopes for the future. Now I invite our guest, Sarah Kabir, to make her remarks.
Hi, Thamindri, and everyone who's tuned in. So I think it might be appropriate to start a little bit on memorialization before I go into stories from the book. But I think a lot of you here might even know more than me on this topic and on reconciliation per se. But I just want to share my opinion, which might give an understanding as well of the background for me doing the book that I wrote. What I have sort of learned in my experience trying to engage in creating sort of innovative ways for memorialization and also for reconciliation, I've sort of noticed one thing, that it's often a very one-sided affair. It's often controlled by the victor or the powerful, right? And in Sri Lanka, at the national level, you see with the government endorsement, you see memories of, you know, people we've lost from the Sri Lankan military being preserved. You see atrocities committed by the LTTE remembered, like the Aranthalawa massacre. And you also see sort of the victory of the war. It's imposed upon by these war memorials that do a very poor job of remembering a war that was fought between Sri Lankans. And then you get the bulldozing of memorials that are not in line with the national agenda. And I mean, we saw this earlier this year, and this is not the first time it has happened. This has happened throughout governments since the end of the war. So what I sort of believe is this sort of attempt to erase history, to erase memories of the past. It deprives the younger generation of lessons that could be learned. One of the other things I've noticed is that memorialization, if it happens, it also happens in a very polarized sort of way. So if you see, for example, you get Heroes Day and then you get Victory Day. And these sort of ways, these days are dubbed as well. It makes it very hard to bring communities together to sort of remember together and not repeat the same mistakes. So what I sort of believe is that there needs to be, yes, there needs to be a space for communities to remember in their own way, but with national support, there also needs to be space for interethnic sort of memorialization. Compounded to this is the problem that our formal education curriculum, the history curriculum, it doesn't teach children about what happened since independence, really. It's left out. A lot of the older folk who have lived through the experiences still have this sense of shame or lajjai to talk about the past. So this means we start to lose the opportunity that memorialization can give, which I believe is the opportunity to collectively remember the absolute sort of cost of war, which is the loss of lives, and for communities to come together and make sure we don't repeat the same cycles of violence again. So on that, in that vein is why I sort of embarked on this project with Voices of Peace, because I believe there needed to be a space to hear from both sides of the conflict. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully I will be able to figure that out. Right, there we go. Okay, so what Voices of Peace is, I'm just going to give a very quick background and I will dive into some stories from the book. But I think it's important as readers to understand a little bit of the context. So Voices of Peace is really sort of a tool that aims to sort of influence policy and support peace building and reconciliation mechanisms in Sri Lanka. It shares the stories of 10 former LTTE cadres and 10 Sri Lankan military personnel. So those who were active agents during the war, but have been moved to passive witnesses during this post-conflict era. It also attempts to provide a balanced narrative of both sides of the conflict and give a safe platform for those who have the most sort of affected but unheard voices of the war, a space that gives them ownership of the peace process, a space that tries to humanize them, and for us to listen to them rather than just talk. The stories go beyond the battlefield. It's really about humans. So they tell us stories about marriages, divorces, music, sports. Their stories sort of take us through their childhood, why they joined the armed struggle, their attempts to integrate back into society after decades of life in jungles or at sea. They tell us what their lives are like now, what their perceptions of peace and reconciliation are, and what their hopes are for their future. Just on the background, I'm not going to go into this deeply, but again, I want to just say a few things that would make it easier for a reader to access this book. It is important to note that when I chose the storytellers, one of the key criteria was that they were fighters, they were on the front lines, so they shot at others or they got shot at. But it's important to remember that they can't be just categorized as one thing. They're also, fathers, daughters, lovers, husbands, and so forth. So it's important that we don't paint them as one thing or the other, and sort of realize the multiple identities that each one of them hold. And I think what might be also important to say is, in compiling the book, I have tried to sort of present the stories in the way that they were originally told to me. So I've respected the integrity of the storytellers' voices, and I try to keep it exactly the way that they told me their story. And along those lines, I have to say that this has not been sort of a fact-checking project, in the sense, yes, if there are dates and places that don't make sense, we double check, but at the same time, these are their stories, this is their version of truth, so it's not up to me to identify what is true or what is false. It is each person's story. I've also arranged stories sometimes around themes, but again, these stories, I mean, each one story moves across time and it moves across topics. And finally, I guess to say is that if you're reading the book, it's majority of the names are pseudonyms, but some were okay with having their real names on. One of the most important things is with this book, I've tried to make us see how we might all have similarities with each one of them. Just in simple things like even how they cook their rice, or the hopes that they have for their children, or the future of this country. So this is really key in what the book tries to do. It tries to get us to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, try to understand their perspectives, their reality, and really ask yourself, what would you have done if you were in that situation? So Tamindra, shall I just go into some readings now, or would you like to add anything?
Yeah, if you could, I think now we can go more on to the section of the book reading, since you've given the background, and then after that we can move to the Q&A of the session. Yeah.
Sure. Sounds good. So I guess along the lines of putting yourself in someone else's shoes and understanding, what would you have done? I feel one of the most powerful stories I always share whenever I talk about the book is this particular one. It helps us to sort of differentiate the LTT as an organization or a structure from the individuals who were fighters themselves. This is the story of Senduran. Senduran, he lived in Matale, and in 83, his whole life sort of turned upside down. So I'm going to read his story. I've just put a small snippet there, but I'm going to read his whole story. So he says, I am originally from Matale. On 23rd July 1983, the LTTE carried out an ambush in Palali. Tamils in Matale and elsewhere didn't even know who the LTTE were at the time. We hadn't committed any crimes, but because 13 Sri Lankan army soldiers died in Palali, we were tortured elsewhere. There were only around 75 to 100 LTTE cadres then. The problem was in the north. What was the point of hitting everyone elsewhere? We had never even been to Vaunia. We were friends with Sinhalese people. I had a friend called Kumara who I played cricket with. I went to a Sinhala school. I couldn't even speak Tamil. In 83, outsiders came to our neighborhood and burned everything down. Shops, kovils, even the famous theater in our neighborhood. I remember there was a bus in our town called Abba and Boni M. They took the bus and took the electoral register. I can still hear them stop at the top of our lane. Luckily, our lane was too small for the bus to turn into. We kept our things in our Sinhalese neighbor's house. They offered to help us. We only had a mat and food to survive. I was 13 years old and full of adrenaline. I wanted to hit whoever came to hurt us. My father was timid, but my mother was tough. She prepared a black bottle, like a beer bottle, with acid. I remember both of us being ready to throw acid if someone came near. Then we saw 15 Sinhalese people coming towards us. I was scared. I was young. Our village people did chase the bus away, but then they started to tell us to go to Jaffna. They thought if Tamil stayed, the situation will get bad for them. I remember my sister couldn't even wear a pottu. So we left. My friends still talk to me on the phone. They don't know I joined the LTTE. There is no point being angry with them for making us leave, but because hatred does not cease with hatred. I am going to read a second story. This is the story of someone from the Sri Lankan army, a lady. So this is her story of why she joined. I always liked the Sri Lankan army uniform. When I was a little girl, I made an army book where I pasted photos of Sri Lankan army women and men. I liked those pictures of the soldiers with the army gears on their backs and the green kit. Poverty was also a reason I joined, but it was mainly because I liked the uniform and I wanted to join the Sri Lankan army. I didn't even know much about the war then. We didn't even have a TV at home. Also, when a soldier dies, they get a lot of respect in society, the way they hold the coffin up. I too wanted that kind of death. My family didn't like me joining the Sri Lankan army because the war was severe at the time. They came to take me back home from the camp, but I refused to leave. My mother stayed outside the camp for a while and cried, but I still didn't go back home. Okay. This is a final story on why people joined the war. My school principal once took us on a trip to the beach. While we were there, 2 Sri Lankan Navy boats arrived at the beach. I can still remember the sailors wearing shorts and arm-cut t-shirts. The principal warned us children to stay aside, so we did. The principal then spoke to the Sri Lankan Navy personnel, but then we saw them get into a fight. We were only small children, so we ran away. The next day, we learned that our principal had been killed. His coffin wasn't opened during his funeral because his face was badly injured. After this incident, I fell sick for 4 days. I began to hate my school uniform, and I told my father that I wouldn't go to school or study anymore. I told him that I would rather commit suicide than go back to school. We were then displaced from our village and lived in many places after that. Once, when we were in Madhu, we had no food, so I would go to the Madhu forest and collect this fruit, which I rolled into a paste and sold. With that income, I would buy rice. That is how we struggled. Then I saw LTTE cadres going around the area in their vehicles, and I joined them just like that. Like anyone else, we too wanted to study, play, and be with our parents. But we were continuously moved from place to place. My situation was such that I didn't have a choice but to join. My education was interrupted. My principal was killed. After experiencing things like these, any child would search for a safer place. I'm going to share a few stories now from during the war, a little bit of different people's experiences. So this is from someone from the Sri Lankan Navy. Once in 1996, we were attacked by an LTTE boat. We rushed to our mother boat and fired at them. We then caught them and tried to take them on to our boat, but somebody decided to kill them before we took them in. It was probably the right decision at the time. If we took them in, they might have blown themselves up, or we would have had to take them to court. We'd have no way to prove they were LTT carders, as they threw away their weapons and were in civilian clothes. Most of the time, they'd come to us claiming to be innocent. And once we got close, they'd blow themselves up. So we were always fearful of approaching them. These are, the next is two stories from two women, one from the Sri Lankan Army and one from the LTTE. I will start with the Sri Lankan Army story. So she says, I was given a T-56 rifle after joining the Sri Lankan Army. On my first day of training, I was so nervous to pull the trigger. The corporal told me not to be scared. And with my eyes closed, I took my first shot. After that, my fear gradually decreased. I was also trained to load and disable weapons. I enjoyed weapons training the most. I liked tough trainings when my body felt pain and fatigue. If we made a mistake, we were punished. I liked the punishment. It was because of such tough training that we could face the war. This is from a former LTT cadre. What she says is, whatever weapons the boys carried, we female cadres carried too. We were never discriminated against on the grounds that the job could only be done by males. Male and female cadres underwent the same training, and there were both female and male leaders. Everything was done equally. We were also trained to carry RPGs and other heavy weapons. I was trained to carry PKs, RPGs, and rifles. It's only at home that people say women should be soft. It wasn't like that in the LTTE. Handling weapons was a jolly experience for me, and we know of how our women suffered, so we wanted to fight on behalf of them. Our trainings ensured that we were brave and confident to carry those weapons. I'm going to go to a little bit on towards the end of the war, and also a little bit with it would be post-war, but important is the important point is interaction. I think as you hear the stories, you can come to your own conclusions as well with it. Okay, so in April 2009, my mother got boxed. A box is when the army rounds people up. I was really worried about her. I was elsewhere and wounded and not aware if she was alive. My wife's brother, who is my friend from the LTTE, was taking care of me. On 16th May 2009, he told me that he too didn't know where his mother was, so he went out to look for our mothers. I couldn't go because I couldn't walk. I was injured. I then heard the Sri Lankan army was approaching us. And in fear, without a moment's thought, I decided to bite my cyanide capsule. At that moment, my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, came. I'm alive because of her. If she came 10 minutes later, it would have been a different story. It's not because I wanted to die, but because I was so scared. That's how we were raised, to fear the Sri Lankan army. My wife's brother was able to locate our mothers and came to take us to the Sri Lankan army side. He said, many are going with white flags. They showed on TV that it was safe. I told him that the Sri Lankan army might harm me. He told me then to marry his sister. Lots of people did that because saying you had a family was a safer option. If you're single, the chances of the Sri Lankan army assuming you're with the LTTE are higher. So at the last moment, people did all they could to escape. But I was identified as LTTE anyway. He then carried me and we went through the waters to the shores of Nandikadal towards the Sri Lankan army. On the other side, there was no more LTTE. Those holding rifles had dropped them. When we crossed over, they gave us biscuits and water. I was badly injured at the time. The Sri Lankan army put me in a tractor. We were kept separate from the civilians. Then they took us to Omante and registered us separately. At that moment in Nandikadal, I was very scared, wondering what they were going to do to us. That was the first time I saw the Sri Lankan army in person. They gave me water, medicine, and biscuits. Even while eating the biscuit, I was scared. I had wanted to take my mother to the Sri Lankan army side before, but from our childhood days, we were raised to believe that if the Sri Lankan army sees us, they will shoot us. So I didn't pursue it. When I was in rehabilitation, I realized it wasn't like that. I realized the soldiers were like us. I saw that everyone was the same. Another story, this is from someone who is disabled now. So he says, in Kandy, I communicated with disabled Sri Lankan army soldiers. When I participate in such events, I feel there is a change within me. When I was leaving, they said their doors will be open for me anytime. I gave my phone number and told them when they come to the north, my doors will be open for them anytime too. At the workshop, I realized they also just wanted to improve their livelihoods like we do. It's like this. I have met you on the road, seen you, but I don't know much about you. It is only when we sit and talk that we understand each other. We realize he is also trying to do something good, and I am also trying to do something good. When you share your feelings, you can come to such an understanding. It was hard to remove memories of the war from my mind. For 3 months after the war, I struggled to sleep. I would think of the war, of being under attack. I tried to read books to help myself feel better. My wife tried hard to ease my mind too. I used to get very angry with her. Like her, lots of people may have faced difficulties indirectly. I was interviewed by media personnel soon after the war, but I found it hard to talk about the traumatic things I experienced. It's easier to talk about it now. It was too soon then. I wanted to forget about everything. But as time passes, you become more relaxed, and it becomes our duty to tell the world what happened during the war and what the Sri Lankan Navy achieved, to keep a record for future generations. If we don't, all these things get burnt with us when we die. One last story, I think, on post-war. Our new duties, or immediately after the war, really, our new duties in the camp were very different to those we had in the jungle during the war. Here, we can't be the way we were in the jungle. Here, you need lots more discipline. People may think it's easier to be back here as we didn't even have electricity or water in the jungle. But this is actually harder for us, especially to adjust to our new tasks. Even menial tasks like ironing is difficult for us. We didn't need to iron our uniforms before, but when we came here, we had to present ourselves neatly because we were around civilians more often. At first, I was scared to return to the camp and to even speak to civilians. It was difficult to get used to the new environment, but over time, I did. So in keeping with the theme of memorialization, I wanted to share from their own voices some stories of memorialization or their opinions of what they think about it. Lieutenant Shankar was the first person we lost. So we've commemorated that day continuously since 27th November 1982. We should be able to celebrate Heroes Day, or at least I should be allowed to remember my own brother. We stayed in the LTTE because we believed if we died, we will at least be remembered. We don't need memorials, but like the JVP has a day, they should allow us to have ours as well without making a big deal. Then, eventually, in a few years, people will not bother. If you tell us not to do it, we will want to do it more. It's like telling a child not to touch something, then they want to do it more. It becomes a problem because it's forbidden. One gentleman I met after I was appointed Joint Commanding Officer of the CSD told me his two children died fighting for the LTTE. He said there are war monuments to commemorate those the Sri Lankan army considered heroes, like Hasalaka Gamini. And so he asked, what about the LTTE people who lost their lives in such ways? Every time they see the monuments, they are reminded that they lost the war. Sinhalese people come here and say bad things, and people here hear them. The people in the South should be educated so they know not to come and do that here. Our people come here to see the war. That is bad. They should come here to see the beauty instead. We don't go to Nuarelia now and say, look at what the white people did. We go there and admire the beauty. If they are coming here, they should come to have fun, to have a drink, use the beach, and eat dosa. It's a separate story. These monuments, like the toppled Kilinochchi water tank, shouldn't be here. They're saying we should forget the past, but they keep these things, and so we can't forget. They should make a school or nursery instead. Every time we go past the tank, we are reminded that we toppled it. Sinhalese people come to see it like it's a big thing, and when they see Tamil people, they look at us in anger. Why do they keep reminding us what we did? In one place, they should have a memorial for both sides. Both sides have lost. When you keep things like this, it'll take over 100 years to forget. Final stories maybe on what they hope for Sri Lanka and for the future of this country. In Sri Lanka, people are always looking for problems. Man believes that to survive, one needs to have problems. Even after all the conflict and pain, we now see attacks against the Muslim community. We sacrificed our relationships with our spouses and our children to gain some level of peace in this country. And now, because of the actions of a few extremists, no doubt, Sri Lanka has to suffer. Why have we not learned from our past? This is another story. Problems might emerge again in our country. It's in our history. Kings have been fighting one another throughout Sri Lanka's past. Now, there are some delinquents trying to stir up issues between Muslims and Sinhalese because they have nothing better to do. If it turns into a conflict, we will have to sacrifice our lives again and go back to war, not them. We are the ones who have to suffer. We gave up so much to end the conflict, it pains us to see our efforts treated so carelessly. I am really sad to see what is happening. I hope it never happens again. And finally, it is important to ensure that nothing like the war we experienced will happen again. People should be brought to a place where they are all proud to say, I am Sri Lankan. Official forms still ask for race and religion. Soon, they'll start asking for caste too. This should stop. The forms should just ask if we are Sri Lankan. I have one important message I want to share, and it applies to Sinhalese, Muslims, Tamils. We should never say Sri Lanka belongs only to me. We must live together.